They say traitor. We say divisive, unpopular, controversial, defiant. They report what she did. We're on to why she did it. They get caught up in the story. We see the big picture. When they rush to conclusions, we rush to the scene. It's black and white, they say. It's never black and white. BBC News. Find out what's actually happening.
This is BBC World News. I'm David Eads. Our top stories. North Korea has fired 2 unidentified missiles. That's the 4th such launch in 2 weeks. America mourns the victims of gun violence in Ohio and Texas as President Trump announces he will visit El Paso. European officials stand firm and insist there is no reason to hold any further Brexit talks with the UK. Also, India's lower house of parliament expected to pass a resolution scrapping the special status of Indian-administered Kashmir. Hello, welcome to BBC World News. North Korea is threatening further weapons tests after firing 2 more missiles. That's the 4th test in just 2 weeks. South Korea's military puts the site of the latest launch at South Hwanghae province. That means the missiles had to fly across the peninsula before landing in the Sea of Japan. To the east there. Now, North Korea has expressed anger at the annual military exercises between South Korea and the US. They're currently underway. And in another sign that tensions in the region are growing, China's warned of unspecified countermeasures if the US deploys intermediate-range missiles anywhere in the Asia-Pacific region. The US Defense Secretary did say he favoured deploying such missiles and possibly within months. Well, for more on those latest tests, I was speaking to our correspondent Laura Bicker in Seoul.
Well, Pyongyang appears to be piling on the pressure. It has launched 2 missiles from its west coast, flew right over the peninsula and landed in the Sea of Japan, also known as the East Sea here in South Korea. These missiles, certainly Pyongyang must have some confidence in them if they are prepared to fire them over their own peninsula. It comes at the same time as the North Korean Foreign Ministry released a statement saying that they believe that the joint US-South Korean military exercises, which started yesterday, were a violation of the agreements that Kim Jong-un had reached with both Washington and Seoul. This is a stern warning. Pyongyang appears to want to put pressure on Seoul and Washington to do a deal. Meanwhile, Donald Trump continues to say he's in no rush. He continues to say these short-range missile tests are not in violation of the promise between him and Kim Jong-un. But the question for the United States and for people here in Seoul is how long does North Korea continue this sort of pressure? And will Kim Jong-un be prepared to step up these missile tests? In fact, fire intercontinental ballistic missiles, longer range missiles, conduct nuclear tests to try to get the attention of the United States.
It's one of these odd things, isn't it, Laura? We've got these, it's almost like twin tracks, that the Kim-Trump relationship goes on, but the relationship between the government apparatuses of these two countries goes off.
Well, when it comes to Washington and Beijing, within the last few hours, Beijing has issued a warning both to Washington and to its allies here in the region, Japan, South Korea and Australia, not to base intercontinental missiles in this region. It comes after the US Defense Secretary Mark Esper said at the weekend that he would like to deploy such weapons in this region soon. The US was hampered from doing so because it had signed up to the INF, a treaty it has signed with the former Soviet Union. Washington withdrew from that treaty last week. It allows them now to deploy intercontinental ballistic missiles in this region. These are the missiles capable of flying 500 kilometres to 5,000 kilometres. Now, let's just give you an example of what Beijing said. It didn't give an idea of what the countermeasures that it was prepared to impose on Washington, but it did say that all things would be on the table, all options would be on the table. And the warning here to South Korea and Japan and Australia will be resonant, because certainly South Korea paid the price for basing an American defence missile system here in its territory.
That's Laura Bicker there. Now, after a weekend of mass shootings that left 31 dead in Ohio and Texas, former President Barack Obama has called on Americans to reject language from any of their leaders that feeds a climate of fear or, as he put it, normalises racism. President Trump also condemned hatred and white supremacy on Monday, and he announced that he will visit El Paso with its overwhelmingly Hispanic population on Wednesday. Now, some of his previous remarks about Hispanics have been considered offensive and have been criticised as racist. That's an allegation he rejects. Peter Bowes reports.
Another vigil. Mourners in El Paso remember the victims of Saturday's attack at a shopping mall. It is a tragically familiar scene in the days following a mass shooting. Donald Trump has responded in a sombre address from the White House. The president condemned what he called the monstrous evil behind the killings.
The shooter in El Paso posted a manifesto online consumed by racist hate. In one voice, our nation must condemn racism, bigotry, and white supremacy. These sinister ideologies must be defeated. Hate has no place in America.
While the president condemned white supremacy, his opponents have argued that his use of racist language in the past could be partly to blame for attacks like the shooting in El Paso. In a rare public statement, the former president, Barack Obama, has issued a thinly veiled attack on his successor. We should soundly reject language coming out of the mouths of any of our leaders that feeds a climate of fear and hatred or normalises racist sentiments. Mr. Obama didn't refer directly to Donald Trump, but his former deputy, Vice President Joe Biden, hasn't held back. He's now seeking his party's nomination to challenge Mr. Trump at the next election.
It's long past time that we, in fact, call out for what it is. This is white nationalism. This is white supremacy. This is about hate.
Coming to terms with their overwhelming grief is the immediate concern of El Paso's residents.
No El Pasoan would ever do this, and I don't know how we deal with evil.
President Trump will visit El Paso on Wednesday. His actions in the coming weeks will be closely watched, with a majority of Americans looking for action rather than words to tackle the scourge of gun violence. Peter Bowes, BBC News.
Now, in the aftermath of the latest Hong Kong demonstrations, Beijing has warned protesters there that it has immense strength and that those who play with fire will perish by it. On Monday, the pro-democracy protesters brought Hong Kong to a standstill. There was a citywide strike then. They're demanding Hong Kong's chief executive, Carrie Lam, stand down. Well, China's Hong Kong and Macau Affairs Office have been holding a news conference. Here's what their spokesman, Yang Guang, had to say.
Every department and institution must take protecting rule of law as their own mission, fulfill their responsibilities, strictly enforce the law, and uphold judicial fairness. Show no leniency to violence and breach of law. Absence of due punishment against breach of law will chip away at the sanctity of law and erode the very foundation of rule of law. Here, let me make it very clear that the central government's support for Chief Executive Carrie Lam is firm and steadfast.
That has just come in the last few minutes. We can get more on this from Steve McDonnell, who's in Hong Kong for us. Steve, I suppose we shouldn't be too surprised, but the language just gets tougher, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Last week, around about this time, we heard for the first time ever from this office. This is the central government's ministry that looks after Hong Kong. And it was more of a conciliatory thing last week. I thought they were trying to sort of dampen things down, calm the situation. Not today. He's come out and there have been threats and warnings. I thought the most ominous sounding comment was along the lines of that these radical protesters should not underestimate the resolve of the central government to end this, nor the overwhelming power that it can bring to that. So, I mean, he didn't specifically say that this had anything to do with the People's Liberation Army, but I'm not, whatever it is, I don't know what other option that could mean. Like, I mean, it does sound like he's trying to tell people, look, if this gets too far out of control, we will come in and end this in a very tough way. So, really quite an ominous message, I thought, so far from the central government. And that press conference is still going on right now, by the way.
Yeah, and the bit we just heard seemed to suggest at least an implicit criticism of Carrie Lam to say that the absence of due punishment was chipping away at the order of Hong Kong, suggesting that they've simply got to get to grips with the ringleaders.
Well, at one point even, they seem to be suggesting that the parents of these kids, as they kind of put it, should somehow rope them in. But I mean, they're university students and older. Like, I don't think that's going to work. He made some comment along the lines of, you know, the analogy of when parents drag their children home to sort of straighten them out and give them a bit of re-education in terms of the mistakes. Parents should go and grab their kids off the streets, drag them by the ear home and, I don't know, give them a whack for playing up so much. But either way, we're coming up to this big anniversary here, very important in China, the 70th anniversary of the formation of the country. There are going to be marches in Beijing. I think that they'd be thinking they've either got to sort this out before that 1st of October date, or it's got to be after then, because they're not going to want the scene of the national birthday with riots in Hong Kong. So this could come to a head quicker than we thought.
Yeah, there's a certain sense of foreboding there. Steve, thank you very much indeed. Steve, bring us the latest there from Hong Kong. OK, we'll pick up on some of the day's other news from around the world for you now, starting in the US, where a Florida man has been sentenced to 20 years in jail for mailing explosives to prominent Democrats, among them Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama. This is Cesar Sayok, who pleaded guilty in March to 30 criminal charges. It was in October, just weeks before the congressional midterm elections, that he sent pipes filled with explosives and wires to 13 people. This is the van he'd been living in, a white van decorated with stickers glorifying President Trump. Mr. Trump has called that plot despicable. Police in London have charged a teenager with attempted murder after a 6-year-old boy was allegedly thrown from the 10th floor of the Tate Modern Art Gallery. A 17-year-old will appear in court later in the day on Tuesday. Police have confirmed that the victim is a French national visiting London with his family, and his injuries are no longer life-threatening. Now, the tensions between the EU and Britain over Brexit, well, they appear to be rising. EU negotiators said there was no basis for further talks given their current discussions. The British Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, insists that one key arrangement for managing the border between Ireland and Northern Ireland, an arrangement agreed by his predecessor, Theresa May, is completely unacceptable. Well, EU officials suggested the UK's main aim now is actually to leave the bloc without a deal. Let's get over to Brussels now. Adam Fleming is following all these shenanigans, dare I say, Adam. And one official saying it's like going back 3 years. Well, you know what that's like.
Yeah, because I was here, as were you, in fact. the British government, at the level of the Prime Minister, at the level of the Brexit Secretary and the Prime Minister's new Europe advisor. They took place last week. And yesterday there was a meeting of the EU's Brexit negotiators with the diplomats from the 27 national governments on the other side of the negotiations. And it was a very downbeat assessment. They said there was no basis for what they described as meaningful discussions with the UK at the moment, because the UK was asking for things that are just unacceptable to the EU. You mentioned the so-called backstop, the arrangements for avoiding border checks between Northern Ireland and Ireland. But the UK has also raised concerns about what's been agreed when it comes to the UK living up to its financial obligations and for a potential future role for the European Court of Justice. But the EU side hasn't totally given up hope yet. They're looking towards the summit of G7 leaders, which will be attended by the British Prime Minister Boris Johnson in France towards the end of the month. Some people thinking that could be the moment of truth, where it becomes clear whether a no-deal Brexit, the UK leaving without any kind of deal at all on the 31st of October, is an inevitability or not.
Adam, could I just ask you, there are frequently issues where the EU leaders come together, they agree something, but of course that has to be then ratified by national parliaments. And if that fails for any reason, they do come back again, they look at it again. They've done it with their own treaties before now. So isn't there a good argument for the British government today to say, you've got to open this up again?
So that's the case that the UK have been making at all those different levels in the last week, that the only way the withdrawal agreement will be approved by the Cabinet, by the British government and by the British Parliament is if those controversial bits are removed. But the EU says, well, no, we're protecting our interests. We've got to defend the integrity of the single market, for example, and the peace process on the island of Ireland. The only way that can be done is with the withdrawal agreement. The alternative, of course, then is the UK leaving with no deal. But the EU feels that it's in a much stronger position than the UK as far as that is concerned. They think, the EU, that the economic damage will be far greater on the UK, and that the EU have managed to put in enough contingency measures that they'll be able to withstand the worst of the damage, and that would be a price worth paying. And the best alternative to backing down is actually having no deal at all. And in terms of how the member states are involved, because of Article 50 of the EU's main treaty, the departure of a member state is treated in a different way from a normal international negotiation. Normally, if the EU is doing a trade deal with Canada, Vietnam, Japan, you'd have the EU negotiating, coming up with a deal, most of which would then have to be approved by national parliaments in the member states. Under Article 50, they get special permission. They do not have to do that. But some people here are saying, well, hang on, if you leave without a deal on the 31st of October, then the UK would then go into that traditional treaty-making process as opposed to the Article 50 process, and that would be much trickier, take much longer, and be much more controversial on the EU side.
Adam, thanks very much indeed. Adam Fleming. Well, do stay with us here on BBC World News. We've got a lot still to bring you, including, you should meet this lot. The big beasts of Transylvania will explain why the European bison is making a comeback in Romania.
The question was whether we wanted to save our people and Japanese as well and win the war, or whether we wanted to take a chance on being able to win the war by killing all our young men.
The invasion began at 2 o'clock this morning.
Mr. Bush, like most other people, was clearly caught by surprise.
We call for the immediate and unconditional withdrawal of all the Iraqi forces.
100 years old and still full of vigour, vitality and enjoyment of life. No other king or queen in British history has lived so long, and the Queen Mother is said to be quietly very pleased indeed that she's achieved this landmark anniversary.
This is a pivotal moment for the Church as an international movement. The question now is whether the American vote will lead to a split in the Anglican community.
You're watching BBC World News. I'm David Eads, and these are the latest headlines. North Korea fires 2 unidentified missiles. That's the 4th launch of its kind in 2 weeks. As America mourns the victims of gun violence in Ohio and Texas, President Trump announces that he will be visiting El Paso. Now, Pakistan has condemned as illegal the Indian government's decision to revoke part of the constitution that gives special status to Indian-administered Kashmir. There are fears of unrest because until now, India, with its Hindu majority, has guaranteed significant autonomy for a Muslim-majority state. Jammu and Kashmir is a disputed mountainous region along the India-Pakistan border. Among the scrapped provisions would be one preventing Indians from other states settling in the region. What does happen now? Well, for more analysis, I've been speaking to the BBC's Rahul Tandon in Delhi.
One word dominating all conversations here in the chai shops, in the rickshaws, and that is Kashmir. The Indian Home Minister Amit Shah has just stood up in the lower house of Parliament to outline once again why this country's government has taken what they say is a historic step to change the dynamics of the Kashmir dispute. But as you rightly point out, while the government here says it's going to integrate the people of Indian-administered Kashmir more into this country, we can't hear what they're saying. The internet remains locked down, mobile phones and landlines have been cut off, schools are shut. My colleagues at the BBC Hindi service have spoken to one of their reporters there who's talking about deserted streets. And this is what the critics of the Indian government are saying. If this measure is to bring peace to Kashmir, why are the Kashmiri leaders under house arrest, and why are we hearing nothing from the valley, which is occupied by millions of people?
But I guess the other reality is, if this was a Modi electoral promise, he can't go back on it. He's got to push forward with this now.
Very much so. This is a promise that the BJP government has had in place for many years. The question of why are they doing it now? I think the simple answer to that is they can. He's just won a huge electoral mandate. This is a policy that is extremely popular in this country. Even his critics are saying if there was an election today, Mr. Modi would come back with the biggest majority maybe this country has ever seen. So they're in a position to do this. But many analysts are asking in the long term, what are the consequences of this going to be? Remember, David, the viewers will remember earlier this year, India and Pakistan were on the brink of war. Kashmir is important to the psyche of both countries. Is this going to help diffuse those tensions? Or when those restrictions are lifted in Indian-administered Kashmir, it'll have to happen at some point. Are we going to see huge protests on the streets and even more violence in a state that has seen too much of it since India's independence?
There, this looks like the perfect arrangement, excuse, call it what you want, for Imran Khan as Pakistan's Prime Minister to work with the military to bolster military personnel, spending, power, I suppose, within the country.
I think you could be right there. Could it be something that actually raises tensions? India's mass forces on the border again. Will Pakistan respond in the same way? I think a difficulty for the Pakistanis, something that will be pleasing the politicians in South Block here in Delhi, is the world seems preoccupied with some of the issues that you've been talking about in this program. So there hasn't been much criticism of the Indian decision. We haven't heard much from the US, the UK or China on this particular issue. So Pakistan's attempts to try and isolate India diplomatically, put Kashmir as an issue on the world agenda, doesn't seem to be working at this point in time. And the other question is, India now looking at a new approach. Is it going to be similar to what the Chinese have done in Tibet, what the Israelis have done in the West Bank, and change the population structure? Many questions to be answered, not many answers coming so far.
Rahul Tandon. Now, after being nearly wiped out a century ago, the European bison is making a comeback. Following successful attempts in Poland, then in Belarus, they're now being reintroduced to Romania as part of a conservation project which rehabilitates managed lands back into wilderness. Nick Thorpe travelled to Transylvania and sent us this.
High in the Tsartku Mountains in southwest Romania, there's enough space even for Europe's largest terrestrial animal. A lorry loaded with 6 bison negotiates a narrow forest road. Bred in nature parks in northern Germany, European bison are being brought back from the brink of extinction and reintroduced into the wild one by one. The first, known as Kurt, seems bewildered by the prospect of freedom. The others seem more enthusiastic. They will be kept in quarantine for 3 months in a large enclosure, then released to join an existing herd, brought here over the past 6 years.
This is a pilot project in Romania and actually in all Europe because we are learning a lot about how the bison are adapting to the area. Our estimation is 60-70 bison, it will form a stable population.
Ecotourism could help reverse the exodus of local people from the countryside. The locals were not sure at first about having bison on their doorsteps, but now they're getting used to it.
So long as you don't do something harmful to an animal, there's no reason why an animal should harm you in any way. And therefore, having bison around, you can very easily go and see them, admire them, they're there, but once we leave them be in the forest, they will leave us be as well.
According to plan, the bison will start a chain effect on the landscape, clearing the shrubs and young trees to restore mountain pastures.
Reintroduce bison into this forest is just, it's a fantastic thing. But in a way, it's even more important than that. So bison are a keystone species. What we mean by that is that they profoundly affect the ecosystem, the ecology of the area. So these are big animals. They graze the forest, they browse on the forest, they open the forest up. And that allows loads of other wildlife to come into those spaces.
Cave paintings found near here prove that bison lived in these mountains thousands of years ago. But the last one was killed in the 1780s. They've been away a long time. Bringing them back now is a bold experiment. Nick Thorpe, BBC News, Armeniș in southwest Romania.
There we are. That is BBC World News. You are right up to date. But coming up in just a moment, we have Business Live, of course. So Ben and Sally will bring you the very latest in the world of economics and business. Don't go away.
Hello. Split fortunes in Europe at the moment. Southern parts of the continent likely to hold on to dry weather and sunshine over the next few days. But further north, it's a bit more complicated. One swirl of cloud here moving across the western side of Russia, bringing some outbreaks of pretty heavy rain. Some cool air coming down on the back edge of that weather system as well. So another unusually cool day in Moscow on Tuesday. And across central, northern and northwestern parts of the continent, you can see all these splodges of blue. Some heavy, thundery downpours becoming increasingly widespread as we head to the middle parts of the week. Whereas further south through Turkey into Greece, the Balkans and Italy, it is sunshine all the way on Tuesday. Rome up to 30 degrees, fine for much of Spain and Portugal, 35 in Madrid, just a bit of cloud and patchy rain to the far northwest of Spain. But you can see these thunderstorms across France, Switzerland, up into Germany, and some particularly intense ones for the Republic of Ireland and the northern half of the UK. Showers and thunderstorms also moving into Scandinavia on Wednesday and through Poland, into Germany, down towards the Alps. You can see a lot of thunderstorms breaking out through Wednesday. There is the potential for some disruption. Now, as we look further ahead in Madrid, those temperatures climb back up into the middle 30s Celsius. Parts of eastern Spain for a time at the end of the week could get to around 40 degrees. In Moscow, it turns less cool for a time, but those temperatures dip away again at the end of the week.
A story brought to life over a new horizon. Seek and you shall find. A place where nothing repeats. Where wrong turns lead you on the right path. With more to discover and tastes you treasure. You find moments that shape your perspective and push you to seek new highs. A limitless dream with a priceless charm. This unique place has many secrets to share. Yours to discover. Find your Dubai.
Need your fix of the beautiful game? Then head to the BBC Sport website and app for live updates and social media from Premier League and Champions League games. With gossip, goal alerts, quizzes, score predictors, team selectors and top punditry. Go online or download the app now.
Now showing on BBC Real.
Loneliness has been called an epidemic of the modern era. The UK government has even called it one of the greatest public health challenges of our time. And the research shows that social isolation is linked to heart disease, stroke, and premature death. It's absolutely true that feeling more isolated than you would like to be can be harmful. And it's also true that even temporary stints of extreme social isolation, like the solitary confinement of prisoners, can lead to poor health outcomes. But all of this bad press paid to loneliness can make those of us who are a little bit more socially reclusive wonder if we're hurting our health long-term too. Luckily, the research doesn't hold that up. Being a loner doesn't have to mean being lonely, and it might just make you happier.
Watch more stories like this at bbc.com/real.
Hello, this is Business Live from BBC News with Sally Bundock and Ben Thompson.
America names China as a currency manipulator. It is another sharp escalation of their trade war.
We're live, we're in London. That's our top story today, Tuesday, the 6th of August. The US decision is largely symbolic and comes after a sharp fall in the value of the Chinese currency against the US dollar. It's prompting another fall in stock markets globally. Also in the programme, profits rise at Intercontinental Hotels Group, but the boss of brands, including Holiday Inn, Crowne Plaza, tells us he's not losing too much sleep over the US-China trade war. So let's look at the European trading day right now. After heavy losses on Monday across Europe, you can see it's a mixed picture emerging today, with the FTSE 100 proving to be the laggard.
And also on the programme, what if you have so much money you don't know how to spend it? We'll meet the man behind a personal concierge service that books those once-in-a-lifetime holidays, posh dinners and expensive days out. But it costs nearly $3,000 a year just to join. And if you could have someone at your beck and call to book that once-in-a-lifetime trip, where would it be? Where would you go? Let us know. Use the hashtag BBC BizLive.
A very warm welcome to the programme. Yes, it's so nice, isn't it, to dream of that perfect holiday. Do send them in and we'll talk about those a little later. But let's start with another major escalation in the US-China trade war. The United States has done something that President Trump promised to do on the day he came into office. But now he's followed through. It's officially labelled China a currency manipulator. The largely symbolic move comes after the Chinese government let its currency fall below a critical level of 7 to the US dollar. The US government says Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin will now discuss ways to eliminate the unfair competitive advantage created by China's latest actions with the International Monetary Fund. That fall in the Chinese currency was widely seen as retaliation for President Trump announcing new tariffs on $300 billion of Chinese goods. That was the latest round of tariffs in the trade war, started because of what Mr. Trump says is unfair trade practices on the part of China.
Well, let's take you live to Singapore, and our business correspondent there, Karishma Vaswani, is following all of this for us. Karishma, just talk us through the significance of this. What does it mean when President Trump accuses China of being a currency manipulator?
Well, by putting China on this list of designated currency manipulators, Ben, it actually doesn't have that much sort of significance in any technical sense, because a lot of the things that you would do once one of these countries is on that list have already been done. For instance, the US now has the right to start negotiations with China. They've been in trade talks for the better part of the last year. They can also start slapping tariffs on China. Well, we know they've been doing that for the better part of the last year as well. The next thing that the US can do is start talking to the International Monetary Fund about some of the mechanisms through which all of this might take place. Well, Donald Trump completely circumvented the IMF with his trade war against China. So in terms of technicalities, this particular move isn't that significant, but the symbolism of it is very, very significant. It marks a real escalation between the two sides in the trade war, and we've seen evidence of that with Asian investors selling off many of the major shares today. They've pared back some of those losses from earlier on the day, but certainly very anxious nerves out here in Asia.
Yeah, and it's interesting, isn't it, Krishma, because President Trump is worried about this, about whether it gives China an unfair advantage in those trades, negotiations, and also in international trade. I mean, I wonder, though, whether it really makes a difference. At the end of the day, China, we know, has been selling so much around the world. Is this just President Trump being a bit annoyed about the dominance of China?
It may well be, but if you look at how the negotiations have gone over the last 18 months or so, and really when we saw back in June just how it looked like the two sides might come to some sort of an agreement, what we're seeing now is that they're further apart than they've ever been before. And if you look at some of the signals coming out of the Central Bank of China today, the PBOC, which is where this all really began on Monday when they sent a signal to the market that they were willing to let the yuan get past that 7 unit to the dollar point. Today, what we've seen is a signal that's being read by many analysts saying that, hold on, we don't want the yuan to get that weak against the US dollar. Part of the reason for that, Ben, is actually it isn't always advantageous for China to have a weak yuan against the US dollar. It makes imports more expensive, the stuff that China buys from the rest of the world, and it also makes servicing debt quite difficult as well. So it's a very difficult situation that China has to navigate at this point, looking strong to its domestic market on the trade war, but making sure it doesn't hurt its own economy in the process.
Yeah, it really is a double-edged sword, isn't it? And I wonder as well, we talk about this being a US-China issue, but quite clearly, as the world's two largest economies, there are so many other economies that get caught up in this, aren't there?
Yeah, absolutely, Ben. What we've seen as a result of the yuan devaluation, depreciation, whatever you feel like calling it, is other currencies in this part of the world have had some sort of an effect. The most obvious one, of course, is the Japanese yen. It's seen as a bit of a safe haven for Asian investors. We've seen that strengthen. That's bad news for Japan's economy, which is export-driven, which is why we've seen losses on the stock market there in Japan today.
Karishma, as always, good to see you. Thanks very much. Karishma Vaswani there, our Asia business correspondent in our business hub in Singapore.
Let's now take a look at some other business stories. Banking giant JP Morgan says it could soon be the majority shareholder in its Chinese joint venture, becoming the first foreign firm to take control of a China-based business under new rules. It's reported JP Morgan bought a 2% stake, taking its total share to 51%. But it comes amid escalating tensions, of course, that we've just discussed on trade between the US and China, accusations of currency manipulation as mentioned.
The online fashion giant Boohoo.com has made an offer to buy the online business of UK brands Karen Millen and Coast. Boohoo says buying the website operations of those two brands would represent highly complementary additions. Any move to buy Karen Millen would see parts of Coast, that's another women's wear brand that it acquired out of administration last year, also be included in the deal.
Facebook's been accused of failing to shut down groups selling fake Amazon reviews. Despite a request by UK regulators to remove the pages back in July, the consumer group Which claims it's found many that are still active. Facebook says it's taken down almost all of the reported groups.
And good news if you're travelling today. Strike action planned at London's Heathrow Airport has been called off after the airport group and the union Unite reached a deal over pay. Dozens of flights were cancelled yesterday because of uncertainty around the industrial action.
Now, have you stayed at a Kimpton Holiday Inn or Crowne Plaza in the last few months? I know Ben has. If you have, you have probably contributed to the rising profits of one of the world's biggest hotel groups. That's the Intercontinental Hotel Groups.
Yes, I spend my life in them, it seems.